This episode of the show is brought to you by Squarespace, the tool to use to make a website for your business, for your brand. More about them in a bit. He is the greatest president we never had. It's the sort of opening line you can imagine using for a number of figures. For those in American history who narrowly lost elections or simply never gained their party's nomination. A lament for those who should have been in the White House but never quite got there. But that's not the sort of person today's video is about. Rather, we're using the greatest president we never had to describe someone who literally did become president. James A. Garfield was elected in 1880 in one of the tightest campaigns ever fought. On entering the White House the following spring, he became the 20th US president. Yet America never got to see what it'd be like in office. Just 100 days into his term, Garfield was shot while waiting for a train. Although he held on for a couple of months, an infection in the wound eventually spelled his doom. And that's a great shame, because the potential was there for Garfield to become a spectacular president. A deeply moral man who'd grown up in poverty, Garfield was a champion of civil rights and determined to reform a corrupt system. That he died before doing so may be one of America's greatest forgotten tragedies. One of the weirdest aspects of modern politics is watching multimillionaires try to prove their working-class credentials, to claim a background of adversity, even while sitting on a stock portfolio most of us could only ever dream of. James A. Garfield would have laughed at people like that. Unlike today's posers, the 20th president really did grow up in biting poverty. Born on the Ohio frontier on November 19th, 1831, Garfield has the distinction of being the last president born in a log cabin. But while the reality of life in early America meant that you could be born in a little cabin while still making it big, the only thing big about Garfield's early life was the staggering adversity. His father, a stout farmer and amateur wrestler, died when the boy was only 1, leaving Garfield's mother penniless. To give you just some idea of how poor the family was, they couldn't afford shoes for the boy until he was 4. As a result of this upbringing, the 20th president would spend his life with what seems like a massive case of imposter syndrome, a feeling that he somehow didn't deserve to be among the gilded elite of Washington. Which is all sorts of strange when you think about it, as Garfield's life was basically the American dream made real. Poor he may have been, but the boy was also exceptionally bright, far more capable and intelligent than anyone else in their corner of the world. And people will recognize this. His mother scrimped and saved to try and find money to send him to school. His older brother went out to work at 11 just to help raise the $17 they needed for Garfield's education. Not that the boy initially wanted to study. Having grown into a big burly lad with powerful arms just like his old dad, the teenage boy was convinced his future lay in a life of adventure as a sailor, not in being a boring old bookworm. Age 16, he ran away, hightailing it to the Erie Canal to work on the boats and experience adventure. What he got instead was a big, great dollop of humility. Unable to swim, Garfield was almost comically unsuited to canal work. By his own admission, he fell in the water and had to be rescued 14 times in 6 weeks. On top of that, he contracted malaria and eventually wound up being sent home to recover, and with that lesson learned, the boy sheepishly returned to education. It would be the smartest move he ever made. Although he had the build of Popeye's nemesis Bluto, Garfield's mind was like a storehouse for knowledge. He could absorb books like a nerdy sponge, and had soon mastered mathematics and ancient languages, as well as gaining a respectable grounding in literature and history. Of course, he still had to work to supplement his mother's meager savings. First as a carpenter, then as a janitor, the boy worked himself ragged to get through school, to get the education that could change his life. This is the American dream part of the tale, the part where Garfield works his arse off and through sheer grit and intelligence alone goes in 2 years from working as the school's janitor to being one of its professors. Perhaps most impressively, he did all of this while keeping an optimistic outlook. As a young man, Garfield was one of those people you're always happy to see. The kind of guy who'll give you a bear hug, buy you a drink, tell you a dirty joke, and then leave you crying with laughter. He hunted, he drank, he chased the ladies, at one point keeping 3 women on the go at once. Yet there was also a deeper side to him, one that brought students flocking to his lectures, that saw him train to become a Christian minister. That saw this extroverted young man at last turn to the career that'd make his name: politics. This was the mid-1850s, when slavery was the issue of the day, and a radical new party had just formed to oppose its expansion. Known as the Republican Party, it would draw in James Garfield, giving him a way to express his anti-slavery beliefs, giving him support when he ran for the Ohio legislature, becoming the state's youngest lawmaker. But it was also the Republican Party that would soon draw Garfield into the biggest test of his life: war. You can see the effect the febrile atmosphere of the late 1850s was having on Garfield from his correspondence, at how increasingly firm his anti-slavery beliefs became. When he attended an anti-slavery lecture as a younger man, he merely noted, "The darky had some funny remarks, and witty too." By 1860, though, he felt comfortable writing, "I am inclined to believe that the sin of slavery is one of which it may be said that without the shedding of blood there is no remission." Which is a clunky 19th century way of saying that the future president was more than happy to settle the issue in battle. We know this because when war broke out in April of 1861, Garfield was among those cheering loudest, not because he supported the Confederacy, but because the North finally had an excuse to head south and smash up the slave system. That year, 1861, Garfield began recruiting for the regiments that he'd soon lead, the 42nd Ohio Volunteers. It was an easy task. The future president was still lecturing at this point, and swaths of his students signed up to serve under him, driven as much by personal loyalty as by their desire to punish Dixie. Although he was a natural fighter, Garfield was also keenly aware that the fate of these men rested on him. During training, he'd blow through entire nights, determinedly reading up on military tactics. In this way, he was not dissimilar to another president we recently covered, Benjamin Harrison, who was also a bookish and brave soldier, and also born in Ohio. But while Harrison would approach war somberly and with a feeling of heavy duty, James Garfield approached it like a bat out of hell. His first significant action was at the Battle of Middle Creek in January 1862. There he managed to direct his forces in such a way that the much larger Confederate grouping thought they were being attacked by multiple regiments and went into retreat, a stunning victory pulled off with limited resources. In fact, it was so stunning that it left Garfield in charge of the whole of eastern Kentucky. By March, it chased the Confederates out of the rest of the state. So impressive was this win that he was made brigadier general. That summer, while Garfield was on leave with dysentery, his friends sought to capitalize on this by putting his name forward for election to the House of Representatives. He won without doing any campaigning. But since he wasn't required to report to Washington for a whole year, Garfield went straight back to the South for another round of war. This time, though, he'd witness an embarrassing Union defeat. The Battle of Chickamauga in September 1863 was the sort of hapless omni-disaster usually associated with the modern UK Conservative Party. Only instead of crashing the economy, it featured Union troops getting their asses handed to them. Yet, even amid this utter show, Garfield managed to come out smelling like roses. One of the only senior officers to return to the field after the retreat began, Garfield made a daring ride under enemy fire to help General Thomas's defense. Although this didn't turn the tide of battle, it was enough to get him promoted to Major General, the youngest man in the Union Army to hold such a rank. It was also the end of Garfield's military career. With the deadline to take his seat in the House now looming, the young man was convinced to permanently leave the battlefield. And honestly, it may have saved his soul. In Washington, Garfield would admit to friends that war had shaken him badly. As one later wrote, "Something went out of him that never came back. The sense of the sacredness of life and the impossibility of destroying it." Yet this glimpse of brutality would ignite a new fire inside the man, a desire not just to see the Union win the war, but to win the peace as well. Now I interrupt this video to tell you about one of our long-time sponsors. It is, of course, Squarespace. Look, you've heard me talk about Squarespace before, and if you're making a website anywhere else in 2022, well, in that case, you're making a mistake, because there is no better, no easier place to make a website than Squarespace. They make it super easy. All you got to do, you go over to their site, and I'd recommend you use a template. Templates are just easier. For me, I've got no design skills. I have no coding skills. I went over to Squarespace. They showed me some templates that I might like. I chose one of them. Bada bing, bada boom. I add some pictures. I customize some text. I add another page if I want to. And when you want to add another page, you're like, I need a contact form. They're like, well, we have a template for that. And you just slot it in there. And it's that easy. It is, slotting it in there is just as easy as it is. Plus, there's loads of other features you can use. For example, like I say, you want to put a contact form on there. It's really easy. And then you don't have to have your email address out there on the internet, which is never a good thing. You'll get all sorts of spam. Put a contact form on there. People can reach out to you very easily. Plus, all the usual stuff, analytics, blogs, etc. There isn't a better place to build a website. So go to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/biographics. You got 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. And let's get back to today's video, shall we? To watch James A. Garfield's career from war to the end of Reconstruction is to watch a radical star slowly lose his fire and dim into a chilly pragmatist. When he first entered the House, Garfield was perhaps the most radical member, arguing for the seizure of Southern property, for the execution of Confederates, for the South to be beaten to its knees. So long as slavery was around, he wouldn't rest, he wouldn't cool off. As he wrote in his diary, "Slavery be damned." Yet, for all the fire he directed towards the South's peculiar institution, Garfield was no John Brown. In fact, his radicalism seems to have masked a deeply conflicting set of racial views. As 1865 saw the Confederacy limp towards defeat, the future president began openly supporting black suffrage. At the same time, though, he was privately writing to a friend, "It goes against the grain of my feelings to favour Negro suffrage, for I never could fall in love with the creatures." From our vantage point, this seems a little screwy, but then those were the times in which virtually all white people, even those who were anti-slavery, had been brought up to consider black folk inferior. And while Garfield may have privately harboured un-PC views, his actions almost always supported equality. That meant voting for the Civil Rights Act of 1866, for the Reconstruction Amendments, for the Ku Klux Klan Act that effectively outlawed the organization. It meant, likewise, voting for Andrew Jackson's 1868 impeachment, yet it would be wrong to claim his voting record was predictable. The longer Reconstruction went on, the more Garfield's radical side started to cool. Whereas 1863 Garfield had called for the smashing of the South, the Garfield of Reconstruction was more cautious, advocating reconciliation over confrontation. For some colleagues, this was an infuriating sign that there was nothing to him, that his opinions would just blow in the wind like a field of ripe corn. To which Garfield's defenders could reply with his clear commitment to America's newly enfranchised black citizens, to the speeches he made, passionately condemning the waves of lynching that had broken out. Sadly, though, it's here that we come to another great contradiction in the story of James A. Garfield. In the long run, his actions may have only made the problems facing black Southerners that much worse. The trigger point was the 1876 election between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden. Now, because we perhaps foolishly set about conveying the presidents in mostly reverse order, you'll have to wait until our Hayes video to get the real lowdown on what happened. But the simple version is that the results were unbelievably close. While the Democrats won the popular vote by 3 points, the Electoral College was gridlocked. With 185 electoral votes needed to win, Tilden had 184, while Hayes had 165. That left 20 electoral votes still in play, just enough to decide the competition. In the Deep South, 3 states were each reporting 2 sets of electors, one for Hayes and one for Tilden, which meant Congress now needed to figure out who was going to be president. In the electoral commission that followed, Garfield served as one of the Republicans investigating the outcome. We say investigating in air quotes here because, when the time came, all the Republicans on the committee voted on party lines to award Hayes the 20 disputed electors. This took him to 185, the exact number needed to claim victory and become president. It again opened the door to a bargain with the devil. In the tense atmosphere following Hayes' victory, Republicans cut a backroom deal with Tilden and the Democrats. If Democrats went along with President Hayes, the North would pull all of its troops out of the South. Reconstruction would be over, and all of the South's black citizens would be left at the mercy of their former overlords. It was the beginning of a near century of oppression, of civil rights denied, and deeply racial violence. In short, it was everything Garfield had made all those fine speeches arguing against. And yet, when push came to shove, it had been his actions that had indirectly helped usher in Jim Crow. Over the 17 years he sat in the House, Garfield witnessed all sorts of political arguments come and go over silver-backed money, over the legality of labor unions. But there was one constant from start to finish: corruption. This was the great era of patronage, when a key point of becoming a representative was not to just shove your own snout into the trough, but also those of everyone who ever did you a political favour. The federal government had no concept of meritocracy, no exams that needed to be taken to fill non-political posts beyond one we might call advanced kissing. The result was a system so entrenched, so corrupt, that pretty much everyone got ensnared in it. It would take superhuman character to resist. And James A. Garfield was no Superman. Like a certain fat orange cat left alone with John's dinner, Garfield couldn't help but snaffle a slice of that delicious lasagna. Only in reality, John was the taxpayer, and his lasagna was the federal budget. Over the years, the future president was caught taking money to help a construction company avoid federal oversight, handing out a corrupt paving contract, and voting to give himself a retroactive raise. Not that it hurt his career prospects. In this great swampy era, corruption was less of a hindrance than getting on the wrong side side of powerful people, and Garfield was a natural at making people at the top like him. You can see this from the way he balanced between the two major Republican factions of his era, the stalwarts who organized under Ulysses S. Grant and the slightly more reformist half-breeds under James G. Blaine. Able to tiptoe between both camps, by 1880, Garfield was one of the few people the entire party could do business with, which may explain the upset that happened at the party convention that year. As the GOP gathered to nominate its presidential candidate, a deadlock emerged between stalwarts trying to renominate former President Grant and half-breeds pumping for James G. Blaine. Now, this wasn't meant to be a problem. Going in, there had already been a compromise candidate lined up in the form of Treasury Secretary John Sherman. Yet it wouldn't be Sherman who wound up getting the nomination. On the 34th ballot, 16 votes were suddenly put forward for Garfield. One ballot later, the number had jumped to 50. Sensing a chance to screw over the stalwarts, the half-breeds leapt on Garfield's bandwagon. John Sherman's supporters followed them. By the end of ballot 36, the results were clear. Ulysses S. Grant's comeback had failed. James A. Garfield would be the Republican nominee. To call this a setback for the stalwarts would be a bit of an understatement. They couldn't have been more shocked if Garfield had personally given Grant an atomic wedgie. Sadly, for the new nominee, though, even with this setback, the stalwarts were still powerful. Powerful enough to get their own man on the ticket, Chester A. Arthur. A man who'd come up under the tutelage of corruption superstar and all-round Machiavellian mischief maker Senator Roscoe Conkling, Arthur was everything the half-breeds hated. It was also essential to Garfield having a cat-in-hell's chance of winning in November. The stalwarts weren't stupid. The man they'd forced onto the VP ticket was from Conkling's power base of New York. And with 35 electoral votes up for grab, New York was a state Garfield could not afford to lose. Hence the meeting the new nominee took there on August the 5th. A meeting where Garfield promised the stalwarts he wouldn't forget them when it came to handing out posts. Although Conkling himself wasn't there, the meeting had his fingerprints all over it, which meant he was now more than happy to use New York's political machine to help Garfield win. On November the 2nd, 1880, Garfield went up against Democrat Winfried S. Hancock in a nail-biter of an election. Garfield netted the narrowest popular vote to win on record, carrying the day by less than 0.1%. But with New York's 35 electoral votes in the bag, the Electoral College was his. Having helped the now president-elect over the line, the stalwarts and Conkling could breathe easy, certain the new guy wouldn't rock the corruption boat. Little did they know that Garfield was already forming his own plans that wouldn't just end Conkling's career, but would bring the whole rotten edifice of the patronage system tumbling down. When telling the story of Garfield's presidency, people normally just focus on the juicy assassination part rather than the 100 days leading up to it. Certainly that's understandable. After all, Garfield, unique among assassinated presidents, had no major event he oversaw before dying. No Civil War, no Cuban Missile Crisis, no Spanish-American War. Yet, it's also only half the story, because to truly understand the long impact of Garfield's short presidency, you have to first look at the big fight that characterized his administration. The fight against corruption. Although Garfield had come up within the patronage system, he seems to have been deeply uneasy with it. By 1880, it was clear the lack of a dedicated civil service class appointed on merit was holding America back, that handing powerful posts to those who'd done you political favors was a shortcut to dysfunctional government. Already the new president was being hounded by people who'd worked his campaign begging for jobs, like the widow who kept writing to him demanding the ambassadorship to Vienna in return for a pro-Garfield speech he'd made. Much better, the new president felt, to simply sweep it all away. The only problem being that he'd have to get past Senator Roscoe Conkling. As the beating heart of corruption in US politics, Conkling stood to lose money and authority if Garfield's reforms went through. Moreover, he felt that it helped steer New York into Garfield's camp during the election. Rather than reform the patronage system, the president should be using it to appoint whoever the hell Conkling wanted. It was this power struggle that took up most of Garfield's time in office, a period in which the president tried to push through reforms while Conkling and the stalwarts tried to block them. Luckily, Garfield lived just long enough to see himself victorious. The showdown came when the president went over Conkling's head to appoint the new collector of the Port of Authority, Chester A. Arthur's old job. Incensed, Conkling resigned from the Senate in protest. It was a tricky move. In those days, senators were selected by their state rather than by popular vote. Conkling knew that New York would re-elect him, at which point he could claim a renewed mandate to fight Garfield. But the one-time Machiavellian had miscalculated. New York could see the wind was blowing in Garfield's direction. After 14 years defining American politics, Roscoe Conkling was now toast. It was the beginning of the end of the patronage system, the first step towards an overhaul that would forever end the concept of doling out jobs to talentless supporters. Unfortunately, this would make one untalented Garfield supporter very unhappy. Back in the fall of 1880, Chester J. Guiteau had gotten on stage in New York before a small crowd and made a barely literate speech in support of James Garfield's candidacy. Although the event was sanctioned by the Republican Party, turnout was abysmal. Barely anyone saw the talk, and those that did simply clapped politely while side-eyeing each other and wondering, is this guy for real? But that's not how Guiteau remembered it. In his eyes, his speech had been the thing that saved Garfield's campaign, the sprinkling of magic that had boosted him to victory in New York, and thus to victory in the Electoral College. Being a reasonable man, Guiteau felt this required a reward. For months now, he'd been writing to Garfield asking for the ambassadorship to Vienna. If that wasn't available, then he was willing to take a consulship to Paris. He was still under the delusion that his reward was coming when news broke of Conklin's fall, of Garfield's plan to overhaul the patronage system. Not long after, Guiteau turned up at the White House in person and was told firmly to give up on the ambassadorship. And just like that, this strange, sick man's mind snapped. If Garfield was indeed threatening to reform the system, then Guiteau needed a stalwart to take over in the Oval Office as soon as possible. And with Chester A. Arthur, the VP, that meant only one thing. Charles Guiteau was going to have to kill the president. It's a strange piece of dramatic irony that around the same time Guiteau was buying a gun and stalking the president, Garfield was writing, "Assassination can no more be guarded against than death by lightning, and it is not best to worry about either." Which is a fine little phrase, but on the other hand, dude, you are literally the president, my guy. Guarding against assassination comes with the territory, yeah? But then, no one in 1880s America believed it necessary. Although the first presidential assassination had already taken place when John Wilkes Booth had shot Abraham Lincoln, everyone agreed it was just one of those awful things that happens in war. That the defeat of the Confederacy had created special circumstances that would never be repeated. After all, presidents aren't like some European monarch, they're elected. And who would possibly want to kill a leader elected by their people? So it was that on July the 2nd, 1881, President Garfield went to catch a train surrounded not by bodyguards, but with only his unarmed friend James G. Blaine for company. It was a fine day, and while he was traveling for sad reasons to visit his ill wife, Garfield was in a fine mood. That morning, he'd playfully wrestled with his sons, then done headstands for their amusement while singing Gilbert and Sullivan songs. He couldn't wait to get out of Washington. After his bruising fight with Conklin, he'd finally get a chance to relax. Except, of course, Garfield would never leave the capital. At 9:20 a.m., Garfield was in the station, waiting for his train, when Charles Guiteau stepped up behind him. There were two sharp cracks. Garfield was heard to shout, "My God, what is this?" And then the president was on the floor, a bullet wound in his back, a pool of blood collecting around him. Amazingly, the bullet had missed his vital organs. If Garfield received an identical wound just a few years later, he would have survived. But 1881 was still too early. Too early for American doctors to have learned an important lesson, that sticking unsterilized equipment into a gaping wound is a really, really good way to kill someone from infection. And that's exactly what happened to Garfield. Under the care of the improbably named Dr. Willard Bliss, and yes, his first name and title were both Doctor, the president was subject to horrific medical malpractice. Convinced the bullet needed to be removed, Bliss repeatedly stuck his unsterilized fingers into the wound until, over the course of several weeks, the bullet hole became a foul-smelling swamp of pus. The most galling part, Joseph Lister had already made his world-changing discoveries on the importance of sterilization. In Europe, doctors now routinely washed their hands, but not in America. Instead, Bliss just kept on letting more and more dirt and bacteria into the festering hole. At the same time, he cut the injured Garfield's food intake to almost zero and began purging him, pumping the president with quinine, and he vomited his stomach dry. By these methods, the good doctor did what Guiteau's badly aimed bullet had failed to do. James A. Garfield died in awful pain on September the 19th, 1881, aged only 49. At the end, his body was riddled with infection. His stout 201-pound frame had been reduced to a mere 130 pounds. It said that his last words were a near incoherent plea for pain relief. At the time of his death, Garfield had been president for only 200 days, still the second shortest tenure in history. While his assassination shook the country, it seemed he would leave no legacy behind. That with Chester A. Arthur's ascension to the presidency, Charles Guiteau's goals would be fulfilled. Only that's not quite how things worked out. In the bleak aftermath of Garfield's death, President Arthur did something he'd have found impossible only months before. He pushed through an act in Garfield's name, reforming the civil service and killing off the patronage system. In doing so, he fulfilled the dead man's unlikely dream of draining the Washington swamp. Likewise, Garfield's death also prompted a much-delayed medical revolution. Faced with high-profile evidence that Joseph Lister's theories were right, American doctors finally adopted the practice of washing their hands and sterilizing instruments. Doubtless this saved thousands of lives every year. Not that realizing poor medical care had killed Garfield was enough to save Guiteau. Although he tried to argue at trial that the doctors were to blame, Guiteau was found guilty of murder. On the 30th of June 1882, he danced up the steps of the gallows in Washington before being hanged. He was 40. Today, President Garfield is barely remembered, known only for getting assassinated and sharing his name with a cartoon cat. If he's known at all, that is. In many ways, this is perhaps the true tragedy of his tale. Here was a self-made man who came from nothing, who was born into biting poverty, and through sheer talent and determination rose to become the most powerful person in the country. He then used that position to try his damnedest to fight corruption that had been entrenched for decades. With such a short tenure, it's perhaps inevitable that history would forget James A. Garfield, but hopefully this video has shown that it shouldn't be this way. That if he can't be remembered as a great president, then we can, at least, perhaps remember Garfield as the greatest president we never truly had.